Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today we're talking about a book review of a popular book that's been out for a number of different years. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steels by Jared Diamond and subtitled The Fates of Human Society. So here's an attempt by a secular writer to explain the history of the human race in material terms only. So he tries to make the case that the reason why the Western world, Europe, and now North America, the United States, why the Western civilization became the dominant civilization of the world, the most innovative, the most powerful, economically strong civilization, is simply a matter of geography and climate and natural factors, that people happen to be at the right place at the right time, and they got an advantage that way. And everything can be explained, he claims, by simply humans reacting to their environment and following the basic understanding of plants and animals, cultivating, domesticating plants, cultivating, domesticating animals, and then they had a ready available food supply when they stopped hunting and gathering and began to farm. And then the populations grew in those areas, and then they were able to have more time to make inventions and develop technology and so on and so forth. And that is simply the reason how civilizations got to be where they are. Because his claim is that human nature, human beings, human ability is pretty much the same, the planet-wide, whether you're in Asia, Africa, South America, North America, Australia, Europe, wherever you happen to be as a human being, your human nature is pretty much the same as any other human nature, and your abilities and cognitive reasoning abilities are the same as anybody else's. And the only difference, the reason why the Western world was able to progress to the pinnacle of civilization faster than, say, the Aborigines in Australia, or the South American Indians, or the North American Indians, reason why Western civilization became dominant was because they happened to be at the right place at the right time and were able to develop, again, the domestication of plants and animals and grow a huge population that then had a steady food supply that was able to not spend all their time hunting and gathering, and was able to develop culture that way. Now, when I first heard this thesis, I began to immediately question it, because as Christians, we know from the Bible, from the history that's contained in the Bible, that there were many instances in ancient times where God directly intervened. And I can think of no greater example of this is the history of the Jews. And there are numbers of books written about the unique history of the Jewish people, the gift of the Jews. I remember that's an important book that explores the very special history that the Jewish people exhibited. And then there are all kinds of books. I believe historian named Johnson wrote a book called The History of the Jews. And again, he explained how you cannot explain Jewish history solely on the natural material causes. And I think any objective look at history of the Jews, for example, will conclude, yes, there is something that is unexplainable about the Jewish progress and development and their influence on the world, even today. So when I first heard that Jared Diamond was writing a book or wrote a book on a materialistic, rationalistic history of humanity using only natural causes, I began to question and say, no, that's not right. And the reason it's not right is because there is a God and he intervenes in history. It is not just a natural progress, one thing leading to another. There are times in the history of this planet where God Almighty, from outside of this planet, outside of nature, the natural world, comes through and intervenes. These are called supernatural miracles, and they happen. Now, Jared Diamond does not believe in supernatural miracles, and so he's going to say, I'm going to try to write a history of the humanities without reference to God or supernatural interventions by God, but he can't. And the number one case in point that refutes his thesis is the history of the Jews. So let me read a little blurb on Guns and Germs and Steel and then talk more about it. Guns, Germs, and Steel examines the rise of civilization and the issues its development has raised throughout history. Having done field work in New Guinea for more than 30 years, Jared Diamond presents the geographical and ecological factors that have shaped modern world. He believes that these are basically the fundamental factors in what determines what civilizations rise and fall. And in fact, I got into this book, Guns, Germs, and Steels, by Jared Diamond, from another book that he wrote called Collapse. And it's an attempt, again, using only materialistic natural causes to explain why some civilizations rise and some fall. Why do people, for example, there was a civilization around the Egypt area called the Nubians, and they were quite a powerful civilization for a time, but then today there's no trace of them as far as a continuous civilization is concerned. Now, what happened to them? Well, Jared Diamond would come at it from a purely naturalistic, materialistic point of view and try to explain it by saying, things like they cut down all the trees and they failed to develop irrigation systems and blah, blah, blah. So it's all a rational, materialistic cause and effect with him. But if you look in the Bible, for example, at the rise and falls of civilization, there is a moral and spiritual component. There certainly was in the Canaanite civilizations that occupied the Promised Land. When God brought the Jews into the Promised Land out of Egypt, he brought them out of Egypt not through natural material causes. It wasn't that, for example, and some people have tried to argue this, that Moses was a revolutionary and he led a group of revolutionaries to leave Egypt. And so they were able to fight their way out of Egypt and win their freedom. That is not the way it actually happened. The way it actually happened was God sent 10 plagues. And out of the blue, so to speak, divine supernatural miracles occurred that forced the hand of Pharaoh to let the people go. That compelled Pharaoh, it says in the book of Exodus, to let the Jewish slaves go. They did not win their freedom. They did not fight for their freedom through some clever scheme or plan. Now, there were some slaves in the ancient times that actually did win their freedom. We can think of, for example, Spartacus and the stories involving the slave revolt of that time. But the Jews did not win their freedom from Egypt. They were actually given freedom by the hand of God, supernaturally, not able to be explained rationally, materially, naturalistically. And so if you believe the thesis of this book and the other one, Collapse, explaining why civilizations rise and fall and why civilizations progress, if you believe that thesis, you cannot be a Christian who holds to a consistent understanding of the Bible, because the Bible gives us a different, totally different explanation as to why civilizations rise and fall. And one of the key factors as to what God determines will rise a civilization and fall a civilization is their moral and spiritual condition. The Jews were sent, for example, into exile into Babylon and Assyria because of their sins and rebellion against the God who had given them the promised land. But they turned away into idolatry and sin, and God gave them up. Actually, God, for example, in the case of Assyria and Babylon, he actually used these foreign enemies as his rod of punishment against the Jews. And whereas they might not have invaded the Holy Land, God, in a sense, made them do that. Now, that is not to say that there are not natural factors involved in all of these episodes. For example, when the Jews came out of the desert, having wandered 40 years and 40 nights, 40 years in the desert, and came into the Promised Land, certainly it would be a hard case to make that this population that came out of the desert actually, through natural causes, through their skill and ability, conquered the Holy Land solely through their own resources, through human resources, or through just sheer luck. No. There was a God in heaven who was opening the doors, and it says also in the Bible, fighting for them, fighting with them, causing them to win, essentially guaranteeing their victory over a greater, more powerful enemy. So they were able to conquer the Promised Land through the power and hand and arm of God, strong arm of God, not through simply natural causes. So we have to say that this thesis that Jared Diamond has is false. The assumptions that it's built on are false. But that doesn't mean that it can't be an interesting read and that we can't learn some things also. Because, again, it's not all the supernatural that God used. He didn't spend 100% of his time giving the Jews supernatural power. There were points where the Jews did things from a human standpoint, from a materialistic standpoint, from a natural standpoint. They had to use their own reasoning. Certain battles, they had to draw up plans that one group would go in the front, the other people would swing around the back and flank the enemy, and so on and so forth. So there was strategy, there was rational calculation involved on the part of the Jews in the conquest of the Holy Land. And there were plans that were laid. Moses came up with plans, and they had to factor in natural factors like the climate and the terrain, geography, and all these other things. So what the Bible claims is not that God totally gave them victory through supernatural means, but that he used supernatural means to help them. And that's what Jared Diamond would not agree with. He would say, no, everything is natural. Everything is supernatural. It can be explained through geography, the climate, human ability, human reason, that kind of thing. So it says here, Jared Diamond presents the geographical and ecological factors that have shaped the modern world from the viewpoint of an evolutionary biologist. Okay, so that's his viewpoint. Evolutionary biology. And what that means is that he is attempting to explain the world and human history purely from a natural materialistic standpoint. Excluding God, excluding any divine intervention of a supernatural being. And that is simply foolishness, because we know as Christians that there is a whole lot that cannot be explained totally, rationally, materialistically, naturally, because of a supernatural God who does intervene. Now, there are some people who say they believe in God today, but they don't believe he intervenes. And these are classically, in philosophical terms, these are called deists. And many of them were present at the founding of our nation. Benjamin Franklin was probably a deist. Also, you had Thomas Jefferson was probably a deist. John Adams was probably more than a deist, but he also sounded like a deist in many ways. And so you had a lot of the founding fathers who believed in God, believed in a supernatural being, but they also said that they felt he had left this planet, left this world, and we were basically ruled by the laws of nature, and we were on our own pretty much, other than just the providential care of God, keeping the planet from crashing and sending the temperatures and the climate agreeable to grow crops and all that kind of thing. So they did agree that divine providence was possible. The founding fathers, in fact, George Washington, who was probably a deist, also talked a lot about divine providence in respect to the birth of our nation, the United States. He felt that it was divine providence from heaven that allowed the colonists to rebel against the British and win their freedom. So there is the whole issue of divine providence. Can that be fit into the scheme of Jared Diamond? In other words, things can have natural causes, but behind those natural causes is a power working through supernatural means behind the scenes. So we can't see that. Yes, I don't doubt. In fact, I do believe strongly in divine providence, that things can appear to be natural. Things can appear to be working through material causes and effects. But in reality, God has all worked through those natural causes to bring about his will. And I believe that he does that. But the Bible is a book that describes that God does more than that. It's not just a supernatural, it's just not a providential situation with God, but that God actually does intervene supernaturally, so that when we look at events in history, it's not just a case where we can trace a materialistic, rationalistic understanding of history like Diamond does, but then say, well, it was God behind all of it, making it all possible and working on his will. It's not just that, because the Bible outlines places where it describes the direct, divine, supernatural intervention of God. And if you look, for example, in the life of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, he healed people, and those are described as miracles, divine, supernatural events. Lazarus in the tomb for 3 days, and Lazarus dead for 3 days in a tomb. And Jesus says, remove the stone, and calls Lazarus from the dead to walk and rise. And he does. That is a direct divine miracle. That is not the result of some natural materialistic cause. Now, there are other places in the New Testament where Jesus rubs some mud and spittle on a man's eyes, and he can see. Now, someone might say, well, he was kind of making an ointment, kind of mixing some medicine together or some natural thing. Well, we don't know of way that you can rub spittle and mud together and create a healing balm. But okay, let's say that that was possible. That would be a case where Jesus was doing some medicinal activity. But that would be a stretch, I think, in reading into the story, modern medicine. No, I think that if you're a Christian and you read the Bible and you believe the Bible, you cannot buy into the materialistic, rationalistic, naturalistic explanation that Jared Diamond puts forth in this book, because he's an evolutionary biologist and they do not allow for God as an explanation in anything. That was very clear in the writings of Charles Darwin. He says you cannot give God any kind of foothold in any explanation. It has to all be naturalistic. And he set about doing that through his theory of evolution. Diamond says he highlights the broadest movements, both literal and conceptual, on every continent since the Ice Age, and examines societal advances such as writing, religion, government. See, again, he would claim, and this is why Christians must reject this theory, he would claim that religion developed, as an evolutionary biologist, he would claim that religion developed out of the ability of populations to have more free time to think and conceptualize life, rather than having to spend full time hunting and gathering and cooking and just merely survival skills. Once people began to settle down and began to farm and cultivate crops and raise animals and became stationary, then they began to have more free time with a stable food supply. They could build homes, have permanent structures, and then they had more time to invent things and come up with technology and write history and write philosophy and form religions. And he would try to explain religion as a purely natural, materialistic, evolutionary development in human history. Again, as Christians, we would reject that. No, it was God who came to us with revelation from outside. So Diamond wants to say that there is no supernatural realm outside of this planet. There is no God. There is no divine will. There's no supernatural anywhere. It's all nature. And so he would say, we invented religion, we invented government, we invented technology, we invented writing through an evolutionary process. And the part about religion being invented by man, again, if you're a Christian and you believe the Bible, you have to reject that. No, we did not invent religion. We did not invent God. God created man, and God revealed spiritual truths to him, moral categories. We didn't invent morality. God revealed this morality to us. Even though we are all made in the image of God, we have the moral sense within us. The fall of Adam and Eve disrupted and brought chaos to our moral and spiritual natures, and in many respects were darkened and actually incapable of thinking through higher concepts of truth. And God has to reveal these things to us, and he did through the prophets, spoke powerfully through them, and originally through the Jews, who themselves, their very existence is a miracle, as I mentioned before. And then eventually also to Gentiles through Christ and the Apostle Paul and the Apostles' missionary work and the building of the Christian church. So for 2,000 years, we've had a combination of God's supernatural revelation, giving us wisdom and helping us to solve problems as human beings. But it's not just the natural, rational, materialistic causes that can account for all of progress. It's a combination of supernatural and natural causes. It says Diamond also dissects racial theories of global history, and the resulting work, Guns, Germs, and Steel, is a major contribution to our understanding of the evolution of human society. Again, the evolution, he's trying to explain on a Darwinian basis the history of humanity. And as Christians, we have to reject that because it leaves out the God that we worship, and it leaves out all of God's activities. So if your explanation leaves out God and leaves out all of God's activities, you don't have an accurate explanation. And so Jared Diamond, even though it's an interesting book to read, and it does, there are many points where it actually is compatible with Christianity. For example, it is compatible with Christianity to say that humans cultivated plants from the wild, and they domesticated many of these plants and the grasses and trees, and cultivated, for example, the fruits that we now enjoy at the supermarket, and cultivated, we have flour, we have barley, we have wheat, and all of these grew in the wild before humans began to get down to the business of domesticating and cultivating them into superior strains, and we can use for our food. Yeah, a lot of that is the same way with animal domestication. We can imagine that many of these animals that we have today, like beef cattle, dairy cattle, for example, were in the wild, and they needed to be domesticated, cultivated, tamed, and used for food and milk and all kinds of other things, cheese. And so, yeah, there is some truth, and there is much truth to what he's writing about, but then the overall assumption that everything in humanity can be explained through natural reason and material causes, that is false. And as Christians, we have to make sure that we are not fooled or tricked into buying into that assumption, because if we do, we're essentially denying our faith, because you're denying the power of the God who the Bible describes as a God who intervenes, and who I believe still intervenes on occasion. Whenever it is God's will and we pray for a miracle of some type, whether it's healing. I prayed many, many times in hospitals for people. I've seen miracles of healing. I believe in that. God intervenes. Those cannot be explained rationally. So this is a good book, but we have to be aware of the false assumptions that are present in that book. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed this book review, and we will see you back on another program. God bless.